Hello, family, and welcome to another episode of the Prescription for Better Living podcast. As always, I'm Dr. Hernando Carter, your board-certified internal medicine physician, yes, your primary care extraordinaire. And this is the Prescription for Better Living podcast, where we discuss all things health and wellness in a hip and relatable way. We are here to promote healthy, happy, long lives in our community. So, if you are a returning PBL family viewer, or if you are a new PBL family viewer, I need you to do a few things for me. Go ahead and like the video, share the video, subscribe to our channel, please. Comment there, stand on the tallest building you can and say, hallelujah, Dr. Carter is here. If you are a regular viewer, if you have come to watch our videos week after week and you appreciate what we are trying to do, if you have found this information helpful to you and you want to find another way to support, then I have a win-win proposition for you. You can support the Prescription for Better Living podcast by becoming a member of our Patreon family. That's right. For a monthly fee, just $5 per month, you can get access to even more behind the scenes footage of the Prescription for Better Living podcast. Also, how about having an in-depth conversation with me about all things health and wellness? We will call these our Wellness Wednesday coaching calls. And it will be a live Zoom call with yours truly in a group fashion. And you can bring any of your questions that are related to your health and your overall well-being, and we'll discuss those with you. So again, please check out the link that's displayed here, patreon.com/Dr. Hernando Carter. And listen, you know what your money will be going to support? It will be going to support this podcast. This podcast is certainly a labor of love. It's certainly a resource that we have created for the community, and it will always be free. But we do need support. We do need supporters, and we need sponsors, because if you've watched me from episode 1 all the way now to episode 19, you will notice a stark difference from episode to episode to episode to where we are now. And that is, we have a beautiful scenery in background. We have wonderful lighting. Our audio is impeccable. Our shots look great. They're making me look good, but it's not free. Nothing in life that's of value is free. Somebody's paying for it. And so we've been doing this week out after week, and we've been paying for this out of our pocket, which is fine, but it's not a sustainable thing, right? And if there are individuals out there who value what we are doing here with the podcast, and you'd like to see it keep going and growing, we want your support. You may not be interested in Patreon. You may not care to be a part of a Wellness Wednesday coaching call. That's okay. You can still be a sponsor of the podcast. Do you have a business and you'd like a shout out on the podcast? Do you have some sort of event coming up that you want shouted out on the podcast? Whatever it is, email us at contact@rxforbetterliving.org. That's contact@rx4betterliving.org. And we can talk to you about, a weekly sponsorship package. So those are ways you can support us. But again, this channel, this podcast, and the content therein will always be free. Because again, our goal is to make sure our community lives healthier, happier, and longer lives. So we are on episode 19. And if you've watched the last couple of episodes, you know where we have been and you know where we're going. Where we've been is we've been discussing health disparities. We started out defining what a health disparity is. And again, generally speaking, it is when you control for all other things being equal. Socioeconomic status, level of education, etc. But there are still different healthcare outcomes based on someone's race. And again, generally speaking, when we are talking about healthcare disparities, we're saying that when you have two people that have the same level of education, they could have the same level of income, they could even have the same job, they could even be next door neighbors and have the same zip code. But one of those individuals is black and the other individual is white. All things being equal, most of the time, the black individual is going to have a worse healthcare outcome. And we ask the question, is it just bad luck to be black? Who would want to be black? Well, me, first of all, I love it. Love being black. I get to go to the family reunion. And I'm not just talking about a specific family reunion. All my black people out there know what I'm talking about. We can turn any event into a family reunion. We can turn a concert into a family reunion. We can turn a church picnic into a family reunion. Heck, we even turn a repast after a funeral into a family reunion. Because there's just something magical about us when we get together in peace, love, and harmony, and we vibe the way that we do. And everyone is invited to the family reunion. You don't have to be black to come to the family reunion. Everyone's invited. But when that Tamia song comes on, you better have been to a couple of our family reunions if you want to know what to do next. Now, I'm not a big fan of the Tamia song, but let me change that. I like the song, but not the dance. Okay. My favorite line dance is Swerve. Now that's my idea of a family reunion. But I love being black. I digress. But in a lot of ways in our country, our race puts us at a disadvantage, particularly when we're talking about health outcomes. And so this is what we're trying to tackle here. So we talked about broadly define what health disparities are. We also talked about the systemic racism that has existed in healthcare. We talked about what are the origins of that systemic racism. We talked about slavery and the medical experimentation of enslaved people being at the root of systemic racism that has been perpetuated generation after generation, and we're still trying to overcome that. We gave examples of that. We talked about the EGFR and how the EGFR as a measure of our kidney function had been a blazing example of what systemic racism in medicine looks like. Remember, we said that two individuals can have a similar kidney number called the creatinine, right? And one individual can have, with the same creatinine, can have a higher EGFR than the other individual. And the individual with the higher EGFR happened to be black, and with the lower EGFR happened to be white. So we had two different numbers representing kidney function based on race. And what that did was it put black people at a disadvantage because we were diagnosed with chronic kidney disease later. And when we were diagnosed, it was more advanced, which means that we progressed to end-stage renal disease and dialysis faster. We were disadvantaged as it relates to being able to be placed on the transplant list and on and on and on. And this has been corrected thanks to the National Kidney Foundation. But that was just an example of what structural systemic racism looks like in healthcare and medicine. Some and most are not as overt, right? There are, for the most part, a lot of very subtle insults that happen in the healthcare system that put us as black people at a disadvantage. We also talked about what happened in our medical education system, where in the beginning there were 20 or so medical schools dedicated to educating African American doctors. And not too long after those medical schools were started training individuals, there was a study that came out that compared medical schools and the resources that were available. And because of this study, all of the black medical schools, except for two, Meharry Medical College and Howard University School of Medicine, closed down. And with the loss of those 18 other black medical schools, we lost tens of thousands of future black physicians. Well, why is that important? I'm glad you asked. Because we know from studies, documented studies, that when you pair a black person with a black doctor, their health outcomes improve. Why? Well, it has to do with trust, has to do with communication, and it has to do with identification. Yeah. So one of the things that we're going to really have to figure out if we want to really turn around these healthcare disparities and promote health equity is how do we train, educate, graduate more black and brown healthcare providers. And we're moving in the wrong direction, y'all. We're moving in the wrong direction. We're not educating and graduating more. We're educating and graduating fewer. As it relates to healthcare disparities, we also talked about the mistrust of the healthcare system in our community, in the black community. We talked about medical experimentation. Remember, I recommended a book for you called Medical Apartheid. Also, we introduced as a concept the Tuskegee study, because the Tuskegee study is cited all of the time by scholars and non-scholars alike of color as to why a lot of black folk don't trust healthcare and why they don't get vaccinations and why they don't get preventative care and cancer screenings and on, because they are concerned about medical experimentation. And particularly when it came to the pandemic and vaccinations, you had a whole cohort of people who were promoting false information, and they would always reference the reason why we should not trust the medical industrial complex was because of the Tuskegee study. So I figured that with this episode, it may be a good idea to take a deeper dive into the Tuskegee study. not necessarily to delegitimize people's mistrust, because how could I do that? How could I delegitimize someone's mistrust of a system that demonstrates time and time again that there are disparities in healthcare, that there still is discrimination in healthcare? Yes, still is. So that's not my goal here, but I do want to make sure that you are informed and that you have the facts about Tuskegee. And as a matter of fact, once you hear some of the facts, it might actually seem a little bit worse than what you thought. Especially if you thought that the Tuskegee study was about injecting people with stuff and all that. You know, it was, believe it or not, it was, I think, even more inhumane than that. And by the way, sponsored, organized, and sanctioned by our government. Yep. So let's get into it. And when we talk about Tuskegee study, there's a book that you can read called Bad Blood. Bad Blood. And if you're from Alabama like I am, once upon a time, it may have been required reading for you in elementary school or in high school. This day and age, with the banning of books, I don't know. But the book is still out there. It's called Bad Blood. Recommend that. But the study is called the Tuskegee Syphilis Study. And as a part of discussing the Tuskegee Syphilis Study, I'd like to introduce you to a few people. There was a gentleman named Taliaferro Clark. He was the head of the United States Public Health Service in Washington, D.C. And the United States Public Health Service had a section called the venereal disease section. And so Mr. Clark was very interested in studying the natural course of syphilis in African American men. Now, let's back up a little bit and let's not assume everyone knows what syphilis is. Syphilis is a sexually transmitted disease. Syphilis can cause a whole host of symptoms. It can cause sores to develop on your genitalia. It can cause spots to develop on your palms and soles. And then it can just go dormant and quiet for years. But in some people, they can develop what's called latent syphilis, and you start getting more systemic effects of the infection. Some people develop neurosyphilis, which, as it sounds, affects the neurosystem, your brain, your spinal cord, your nerves, etc. Could cause behavioral changes, hallucinations, memory loss, confusion, make it seem like people have dementia. And to this day, when we are evaluating someone for memory loss, and before we diagnose them with dementia, we actually test for syphilis, because syphilis, if detected, is treatable and curable with penicillin. Also, you could develop some cardiovascular effects on your heart from syphilis. You can certainly die from syphilis. So that's what syphilis is. And Mr. Clark was interested in studying syphilis. The basis of his interest came from a study that was done in Norway on white men that looked at the effects of syphilis on white men. And this is well before a cure for syphilis was discovered. And so they didn't really have any effective treatments. And so in Norway, they studied what the effects of untreated syphilis would be in white males. And Mr. Clark had a hypothesis, just like any scientific study will have. You have a hypothesis, right? And his hypothesis was that white people were more likely to develop neurosyphilis and that black people were more likely to sustain damage to their cardiovascular systems. And so the genesis of the Tuskegee syphilis study was to make this comparison about did syphilis behave differently in white men versus black men. So that's Mr. Taliaferro Clark. Also, let me introduce you to Thomas Parran Jr., Parran. And Thomas Parran Jr. was the health commissioner of New York State. But the common thread here is that he was head of the venereal disease division at the U.S. Public Health Service. So venereal diseases are talking about sexually transmitted diseases. And Mr. Parran was brought in by a fund called the Rosenwald Fund that funded, research studies, etc. And so the Rosenwald Fund called in Mr. Parran to help with this study. And they decided to pick southern states. And Mr. Parran's conclusion was that Alabama, in particular Macon County, was an ideal location for the study. Now, let me introduce you to a couple of more people, because there were African Americans who were implicated in the Tuskegee syphilis study. You may remember hearing Miss Rivers. Nurse Eunice Rivers trained at Tuskegee Institute and worked at its hospital. And she was recruited to be the nurse for this study. But really, she was the glue, if you will, of this study, because she was the main contact of this study. She was the one that the people in the community trusted. They looked to her to say, do you trust this? They contacted her when they had questions or problems. And she was the only person involved in the study to work with the participants the entire time. That's a full 40 years. As a part of the study, the men were considered to be a part of Miss Rivers' Lodge. And at Miss Rivers' Lodge, study participants would receive free examinations, free medical examinations, free rides to and from the clinic, hot meals on examination days, and free treatment for minor ailments. Sound like a great deal. Also, when the men died, Nurse Rivers was very instrumental in getting the families to agree to autopsies. And in exchange for the autopsies, the families would receive funeral benefits. And let me tell you why this is a big deal. First of all, it's hard to get black folk to agree to an autopsy now. Now, can you imagine in 1930 how foreign the concept of autopsy might have been? But also imagine in 1930 how rare it would have been for individuals, particularly in this geographical location, to have burial insurance. So it was important to get them to consent to the autopsy, because how are you going to study the effects of latent or end-stage syphilis except for post-mortem? So you need them to die so you can do an autopsy and then study what effects syphilis had on the body. So that was Nurse Rivers. There were other Black healthcare providers, Black doctors, etc. And one thing that I want you all to remember is that medical apartheid is not white people just solely doing something to Black people. We're talking about, when we talk about the Tuskegee syphilis study, this was an indictment on the entire medical industrial complex. And I'm using that phrase very intentionally. The medical industrial complex included government agencies. It included academic medical institutions. It included colleges and universities. It included organized medicine, the AMA, the American Medical Association, NMA, National Medical Association. They depended on Black doctors to encourage their patients to continue in the study. And when a cure for syphilis was discovered, penicillin, and it was widely available, those doctors were encouraged not to treat their patients with penicillin, which would have cured them. Also, when Black men of color signed up to fight for their country in World War, syphilis was being tested for in all of those recruits widely because it was so widespread. What do you think happened to those soldiers or those recruits who tested positive for syphilis? Well, if you were not a part of the Tuskegee syphilis study, you got a big old dose of penicillin. Yep. And that cured you, and you could go and serve and fight for your country, World War II. But if you happen to be a part of the Tuskegee syphilis study, those infected individuals who showed up at military induction centers were on a registry, and they were ordered to go back to where they came from. They couldn't serve in the military because they had syphilis, but they couldn't be treated for syphilis, even though a treatment was available to those in the military because they were part of the study. That is the medical industrial complex. And it also includes pharmaceutical companies and now insurance companies. Everyone that profits from our healthcare. So that's kind of setting the stage for the Tuskegee syphilis study, or the Tuskegee experiment as it's also known. It started in 1932 And it lasted 40 years to 1972, y'all. Now, I know there's some babies out there who weren't even thought about in 72. Heck, I wasn't even thought about in 72. But I was born in 79. This study ended just 7 years before I was born, y'all. So we're not talking about ancient history here. So we're talking about my aunts and uncles, my father and mother, my grandparents and their relatives and siblings all heard about and knew about this study. It's fresh. And so this is why the mistrust of the medical industrial complex is still so fresh and so palpable in our community. Did you know that this went on well after the passage of the Civil Rights Act? Yeah. This was still going on when Dr. King was marching the streets. So it's fresh. It was terminated November 16th, 1972. By then, 28 patients had died directly from syphilis. 100 had died from complications related to syphilis. 40 of the men's wives were infected with syphilis because it is a sexually transmitted disease. And if you are married, if you're a married man, you're going to consummate the marriage with your wife. And odds are, if you're infected with something, you're going to pass it to her. Also, there's a thing called congenital syphilis, where syphilis can be passed in the womb from mother to baby. 19 children were born with congenital syphilis. 40 years of the Tuskegee syphilis study. $40 of ethical violation. 40 years of moral violations. It was horrible. So, you know why else this study was so bad? I mean, it's bad enough what I have described. But what else made this so bad was that you took impoverished African American sharecroppers. My grandmother was a sharecropper. My great-grandfather, Levi Carter, was a sharecropper. Grandmother went to 3rd grade. My great-grandfather, I don't know that he went that far. But we're talking about good, salt of the earth people, human beings. But they were impoverished sharecroppers, which meant what? They could be taken advantage of and exploited because they were vulnerable. They weren't very well educated. And so it was easy to mislead them. These people did not know that they were signing up for a death sentence. They were led to believe that these special examinations that they were receiving were treatments, that these lumbar punctures that you use to drain fluid off of the spinal canal, they thought those were treatments. For the non-medical and uninitiated, a lumbar puncture is when you take a spinal needle, a long needle, and you stick it in the person's back in between their vertebrae into their spinal canal to pull off spinal fluid. And it's still done today to test individuals for things like meningitis or the presence of cancer. But these men were not receiving a treatment. They were just receiving lumbar punctures to see if they had syphilis in their spinal fluid. And then once the syphilis was discovered in their spinal fluid, we didn't do anything with that information except lie to them and tell them that the things that we were doing was treatment for their bad blood. It's what they call the condition, bad blood. So at the beginning of the study, there were no real effective treatments, but they tried some treatments on them. And some of the major medical textbooks had recommendations on how to treat syphilis. And these included compounds that were arsenic based, they said that this was mildly effective and highly toxic. Mildly effective and highly toxic, which means not worth it. Also, the men were told they were receiving medication and they were given what we call placebos, which is not a real medicine. It's fake. It's made to look like a real medicine. It's like a sugar pill. So the tragedy in this is that we had the exploitation of vulnerable population without their informed consent, and they were given false hope. They were lied to. It was an ethical and moral and spiritual failure. So they enrolled 600 of our people, 600 of our ancestors. Hardworking, pull yourself up by the bootstraps, salt of the earth sharecroppers from Macon County, Alabama, into this study. And some of them, they enrolled in the control group, about 200, who did not have syphilis. And they compared them to the people who had it. They looked at the physical manifestations and symptoms. And then they waited until they died. And they dangled funeral benefits in front of these impoverished, salt of the earth, vulnerable people to allow them, or to not allow them, to coerce them into sending their loved one through an autopsy. The other tragedy, y'all, is that we discovered a cure for syphilis. I've told you what that cure is. And we still use that cure today for syphilis. I have, in my medical career, diagnosed several men with syphilis here in Jefferson County, Alabama, because we are a hotbed for syphilis. And you know what I was able to do? Order them penicillin injections that cured them of their syphilis. So we have the discovery of penicillin as being proven to be a cure of syphilis. That was about 1943. So for almost another 30 years after the cure of syphilis was discovered, Nurse Eunice Rivers and the medical doctors and the people of Tuskegee Institute and the Public Health Service and the Center for Disease Control and the American government allowed these people to die. Could you imagine having a fire engine and you see buildings burning? Let's say this building, say it's a house, a 3-story house, and the fire is in the basement, and the fire engine shows up while the fire is still ablaze in the basement. Nothing's wrong with the fire engine. It's functional. There's a water connection. There's a water hookup. They're qualified and certified firefighters who know how to operate the equipment. And the powers that be decide, nope, let's see what happens when the fire goes to the first floor from the basement. Let's let the fire go to the second floor. You want to give them water yet? Nope. Let's see what fire does. Fire goes to the third floor. It's on them now. It's hot. They're screaming, help, help. Cries for help. But no water is administered. They're allowed to burn to death. Sounds dramatic, but that's what we allow to happen to these men. Because of that, though, we know what the effects of syphilis are. We know about neurosyphilis, and we know about cardiovascular effects of syphilis. It's because of their sacrifice that we know that. And it was wrong, y'all. I won't even say fortunately, but because of this study and other studies like it, the way we do medical research is a lot different now. Now we have internal review boards, IRBs, who are independent individuals who have to oversee medical studies. Yep. You have to give informed consent, meaning you have to let someone know who volunteers for the study. You have to let them know what is involved, what's the benefits of the study, what's the risks, etc. Yep. You have informed consent where they have to sign that they understand it. And they can leave the study. It's voluntary if they want to. And studies are often stopped early for many reasons. But a lot of times, if the study shows that for the people who are in the treatment arm, they're doing a whole lot better than the people in the placebo arm, they stop it because they say, this can benefit everybody. And it's not right, it's not ethical to know that the people over here in the treatment arm are doing so much better than the people in the placebo arm. We got to also give it to people in placebo arm. Example, you're studying a new treatment for cancer. And let's say over here in this arm, you have the people receiving the new treatment. And over here in this arm, you have people who are receiving the standard treatment. So it may not be placebo, right? It may be just right now, this is the standard acceptable treatment for this cancer. And over here is the experimental treatment. Well, guess what? If the experimental treatment shows so much more benefit and effectiveness than the standard treatment, study stopped early. And everybody gets the new experimental treatment because it's more beneficial. Also, experimental treatment for cancer, standard treatment for cancer. Let's say now we're looking at side effects and deaths. And side effects and deaths go like that. The people in the experimental treatment arm have more side effects and higher amount of deaths than the standard treatment. Guess what? Study stopped. There's more risk, there's more harm than benefit, and it stopped early. You can feel safe now doing research, participating in research in our country, because there's all kinds of boards and everything else watching, and they watching like a hawk, baby. But it's because of our ancestors in the Tuskegee syphilis study. Let's exhale, y'all. That was heavy. That's the first time that I've had the opportunity to really go into an in-depth discussion about this study. Because typically when I'm talking about it, it's just, it's during a visit with a patient or something, and I don't have enough time to take that much time. But I'm really trying to convince the patient to do something that they need to do, like take a vaccination or do a screening test. And they talk about, what about Tuskegee? And I just have to kind of talk to them about it real quick. But this was the first time I had a chance to just really kind of go in depth. And I got to admit, that was emotional for me. It's kind of infuriating. Like when you say it out loud, like it's up here, you know what I mean? But when you take it from here to here, it makes you mad. Fight mad. So I don't want you to think that this discussion of the Tuskegee experiment was given to you so that you can weaponize it against the healthcare system and say, this is why you don't participate, and this is why you don't do this, and this is why you don't do that, that's still an excuse. But again, if we are going to tackle these health disparities, we got to take a hard look at what's happened in our country and then put that in the context of why today there's mistrust. Now, this study ended in 1972. I was born in 1979. But there are people born in the 90s, in the 2000s, who don't trust the medical system. And they don't really know why they don't trust it, except for it was handed down to them, like a family tradition. Their parents didn't trust doctors because their parents didn't trust doctors, because their parents didn't trust doctors. But it all goes back to things like the Tuskegee experiment. So what's my answer to that? Well, again, like I said, now you don't have to worry about this happening in our country because we have checks and balances. We have learned from our mistakes. And you can trust the process now. Not necessarily because all of the people involved in the process are that much more trustworthy than their counterparts back then. No. But it's because we have checks and balances. It's because we have watchdogs, because we have whistleblowers who make a living by waiting to catch somebody slipping. And you best believe me, if they can catch somebody slipping, oh yeah, absolutely. They're going to catch them because money make the world go round. So they get paid to catch you. It's their job. Have regulators now. Yeah. So that's why you can trust scientific research and medical studies now. And we still got a ways to go. We still have work to do just overall in our healthcare system. But having tough conversations like that, having people who look like me matriculate, educated, and graduate from health profession school, who can be in positions to hopefully impact things for our people in our community in a positive way, that's how we turn around these healthcare disparities. So this has been a heavy episode, but another episode of the Prescription for Better Living podcast. You know what I need you to do. If this episode and this podcast are helpful to you in some way, we need you to make sure you subscribe to the channel. We need you to make sure that you like the video, that you comment on the video, that you stand on the tallest mountaintop you can and scream, hallelujah, Dr. Carter was here. Until next time, it's Dr. Carter saying, peace out.